So I'm going to tell you the story of Phryne, who is a victim of misinformation in classical Athens. But it's a piece of misinformation that is so powerful that it circulates well into the 20th century. So first of all, let me set the scene for you. I'm going to focus in on a particular type of misinformation, that is on gossip, which is a powerful social force in the ancient world and in the modern world. Now, I'm quite sure that none of us here present gossip at all, but we all know how it works. The identification of a target, the development of a network of support for accusations and allegations about that person. And it works best if those stories fit what we think we know about the person or how we feel about them. And in the ancient world, it was particularly envy that was related to gossip, phonos. And let me just show you if this works. Come on. Oh, no. This is a mosaic that shows envy personified. I think you can see the hands wrapped around the throat, strangling or stopping that person from breathing, and the wild animals attacking from every side. So phonos, envy, was a very intense emotion, and it's what's related across many of our sources to gossip. Now, these are not just literary depictions of gossip, but this is evidence for everyday life, ordinary men and women's experiences. And I want to draw on some of these and tell you some small stories about gossip, just to set the scene before we get to our main story, which is about Phryne. So let me show you, come on, yes, this, which is my first piece of evidence. We're going to start with stories about accusations. And this is the gravestone of a woman called Zosime, a daughter of Heraclion, and she lived in Syria. That's what we know about her life. What we know about her death is that she died violently. And we know that because of those hands. When we find those inscribed on a gravestone, they mean that her family have sworn to avenge her violent death. Now, we get a lot of these across the Greco-Roman world, and some of them are more explicit. Okay, so this is the gravestone of Marthina, one Marthina, who lived in Ranea near Delos. And you can see here that her family think that she has died as a result of the trickery or poisoning of someone. They don't name who it is. And again, you see that they are calling for vengeance on the person who killed her. Now, you may say to me, Esther, how is this gossip? Right? None of the perpetrators are named. But that is specifically how gossip works. So lean into the idea of a small community where there are lots of social tensions. Imagine how gossip takes the gap in this inscription, fills it with a story, identifies the culprit, and then from that process develops an accusation. And we can see a little bit about how this works in more inscriptions. Oh yes, I have many. Okay, let me show you some from curse tablets. Curse tablets, terrific. Strips of lead, this is the remains of one. You have an enemy, you write a spell against them, you roll up your strip of lead, you stick it in the ground. Now, this is what happens to most of them, but we have a number that seem to have been nailed to the wall of a temple of Demeter in southwest Anatolia, and they are written by people who have been accused of crimes. Let me give you an example. This is written, we don't know the name of the woman. We do know that there's a story circulating in her community that she was trying to poison her husband. So she has written this little curse, stuck it up in the wall of the temple, and it protests against the story. She wants the person who's spreading the story, she also doesn't name them, to come to the temple and come in pain and burning. Let me give you another example. This one, she does name herself. She's called Antigone. And she's dealing with the multiplication of gossip, because stories breed stories. And she's being accused not only of doing the poisoning herself, but maybe she didn't do it, but she paid someone else to do it. And instead of saying she wants the accuser to come to the temple, she says, bring me. If I'm lying, take me to the temple, O gods, and have me come burning and in pain. And this brings me to my last small story, which is a wonderful confession inscription about a woman called Tatias. And she also has been accused of hurting someone, of driving a man called Jacundus mad. And so she goes to the temple, like the other two women, and she says, no, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. A few days later, her son dies in a bizarre gardening accident. And what we can see in the inscription is that the story, the gossip, absorbs this event and turns it into further confirmation of her guilt. So those are the small stories that give you a little sense of what we're talking about in terms of the development of gossip in an ancient society. Let me turn now to Phryne and the Athenian law courts. Now, Phryne is accused of impiety, and that's quite a rare thing for a woman to be brought to court in ancient Athens. Doesn't happen. So, or very often. So, what can we know about Phryne? Well, we know that she's a woman. She's a hetaira, which means she's a freelance independent sex worker. She works quite a lot with rituals. She seems to be a freelance priestess. And she's politically very well connected. So in a lot of ways, she embodies what we would call social risks in Athens. And so she attracts gossip. And that's dangerous, because in the Athenian law courts, gossip is the basis for a legal charge. You can watch it happen coming up from the streets and into the law courts. And I think this is what happens to Phryne, because in the evidence for the charges against her, you can see the judgment of gossip stories. So yes, she's running ritual events. She's a priestess of some kind. And in one, they say, oh, she invited men and women to party shamelessly in honor of the god. The other accusation or version of the charge against her says, no, it's just women she's inviting. But what women? These are women of low status, of doubtful reputation. And so I think we can see in these the gossip that is circulating about Phryne and the way in which it then becomes a legal charge. But this is not the only misinformation. My final piece of misinformation about Phryne is this. The story was told that at the end of her trial, the man who was defending her, Hyperides, tore off her clothing and showed her body to the dikastai, to the judge and jury. You'll be pleased to know they therefore acquitted her because they were in awe. She looked like a goddess. But what's interesting about this is that this story has circulated as historical fact in modern scholarship well into the 20th century. And it's only relatively recently that people have pointed out that this story is found in our sources centuries after the actual law court case. That's when it appears. It's historical gossip. It's misinformation. And I think it sticks to Phryne because, like all good gossip, it encapsulates everything that is implied about a dangerous woman like her. And I think it illustrates really well the ways in which gossip, misinformation, is really hard to let go of if it confirms what we think we already know. And with that, I'll leave you.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating, Esther. I loved the story of Phryne, and it is a bunch of men, basically. Oh, she took her clothes off. She looks amazing. And the thing it reminds me of, actually, is the Profumo scandal and Christine Keeler. And again, a woman at the nexus of sort of politics and power.
Yeah.
So is it something about the position of someone that makes them particularly vulnerable to misinformation? Is it the vulnerable, powerful in one sense, but vulnerable because she's a woman, because of the work that she's doing, that makes it somehow easier to spin lies?
It's a really interesting question, and I think yes, for some people. It depends. One of the parallels we can draw with Phryne is 40 years earlier, the trial of Socrates, and he is actually prosecuted on the same charge, which is impiety. And again, it's a big, baggy charge. You can stick in a lot of things that you're worried about. He is perceived to be powerful, and that's what worries people. And so it's a way, Thonos and envy, we can see moving much more clearly in his trial because we have lots of accounts of it, and they associate envy and gossip together in the documentation for his trial. But we can see the ways in which people both are envious of his claims to a closer relationship with the divine, which Phryne also has, and also that they're worried about his political power. And so they want to take him down. And we can see the power of it, and also then his vulnerability to that gossip. So it works, it's a double-edged sword, I think.
And just briefly, because it's interesting when we come to talk more about the modern way in which misinformation spreads, the spells and the sort of little lead inscriptions that you talked about, I mean, those were quite personal, private. Not many people would have seen those, would they?
Well, this is the good question about this, because spells, no, on the whole, not at all. You roll them up, you bury them. And part of then how they work may be the gossip that is about the social relationship that has prompted them. So it's the gossip that works the magic, if that makes sense. Right. The particular ones I show you are slap bang on a sanctuary wall. Everyone's going to see them. So actually, as well as expressing displeasure at the gossip, they're also helping to spread it.
Fascinating. Now, I'm actually going to push my chair back a little bit because I feel like I've got my back to you. We will come back to some of that because, Alvin, it's time to hear your story now. Quite a contrast, I think, with Esther's. A very modern feel, but some themes that I think are going to run through our entire conversation.
Thank you, Ritala. So my case study looks at a huge political scandal from the politics of the mid and late 1880s. And I think, as Ritala has suggested, it speaks to some very contemporary themes, though actually there is an overlap with Esther's work as well. So the themes that I have in mind are political violence and political polarization, prejudice and confirmation bias, the sometimes toxic links between profit and the production of evidence, and the sometimes toxic links between government and media. It's the story of a trusted newspaper allied with representatives of a major political organization as well as government, operating together in a polarized political environment and propagating misinformation. The hugely polarized politics of the 1880s in some ways speak to our own politics in the UK over the past 10 years, I think. In the 1880s, the particular polarization was created by the extreme tensions which existed between the supporters and opponents of Irish land reform, but more particularly Irish Home Rule. Home Rule for Ireland was embraced by Gladstone and the Liberals in the mid-1880s, and the intense debate which followed this embrace, this conversion, brought the reconfiguration of politics across these islands. Successive Home Rule bills deepened the political fault lines, they intensified political emotions, they sharpened ultimately the threat of civil war. Violence, or the threat of violence, was the backdrop to these debates. One of the most shocking of the acts of violence in this period came early on in May 1882, when a government minister, Frederick Cavendish, Lord Frederick Cavendish, and the head of the Irish civil service, a man called Thomas Burke, were killed in Dublin in a frenzied knife attack. And the assassins belonged to an extremist nationalist, a marginal body, secret society called the Invincibles. But ongoing violence more generally sharpened the divisions in politics at this time. And then, as now, division was complemented by distrust. Irish politicians didn't trust British politicians to deliver democratically mandated reform. British conservatives and unionists, for their part, were convinced that Irish nationalist leaders were implicated in extremism. And they were certain in their own minds that Charles Stuart Parnell, who's illustrated on screen on the left, he's the leader of the Home Rule movement at this time, and they believed that he was actually implicated in the killings of Cavendish and Burke in May 1882. Now, in fact, Parnell, who certainly walked a tightrope as the nominal leader of a very large, very complex, very broad national movement, had nothing whatsoever to do with this extremism and with these killings, and he roundly condemned them. But the condemnations simply weren't believed by his political opponents at the time. And I think at this point, confirmation bias feeds into misinformation. This was an age dominated by the print media, and one market leader was the Times newspaper. The Times had a huge moral and political authority. It came out against Irish Home Rule. Its management was disturbed by social and political agitation in Ireland, and its management was disturbed by what they saw as the instigator of this agitation, Parnell. For long, however, the paper had no clear evidence to back up these suspicions. There was no clear evidence that Parnell had any direct association with the extremists. But in the autumn of 1886, this evidence suddenly appeared. Several parcels of letters, apparently sourced from within the nationalist movement, and including 5 seemingly written by Parnell himself, arrived with the Times newspaper. And the overall effect of this batch of correspondence was to suggest that Parnell had given direct personal encouragement to the perpetrators of outrage in Ireland. Now, the Times' reasons for accepting this correspondence were clear. The signatures on the letters were authenticated by the leading handwriting expert of the day. The immediate source of the correspondence was a political activist, but also a journalist who had worked for the Times and was known to them. But I think above all, the story of the letters was entirely consistent with the suspicions that had long been entertained in the paper. In short, the letters confirmed what the Times already believed. So they opted to publish. The letters were reproduced as part of a devastating indictment of the Home Rule movement, which was carried as a set of leaders in the paper in the spring of 1887. And the leaders had, as you might expect, a huge popular and political impact. And in particular, they allowed the Conservative government of the day to set up a special judicial commission designed, certainly from the government's perspective, to expose what they believed were the interconnections between the Home Rule movement and political criminality. The government, which was in communication with the Times newspaper, intended that this special commission would destroy Home Rule for Ireland and destroy Parnellism as well. Now, in fact, what it ultimately demonstrated was somewhat different. The sessions of the special commission ultimately revealed that the critical Parnell letters, which lay at the heart of this newspaper attack, were forgeries. They had largely been produced by a plausible but perpetually broke Dublin journalist and former newspaper proprietor, Richard Piggott, who is illustrated on the right-hand side of the screen. And his main motive, he was an ex-nationalist, a refugee from nationalism. His main motive appears to have been money. There was, in fact, a strong suggestion that the letters had originally been sourced and paid for by the main Irish Unionist organisation of the day, the Loyal and Patriotic Union, amongst Parnell's key opponents in Ireland at the time. And the Commission made clear that, yes, the Times had checked with handwriting experts, but they'd also ignored key legal advice. They hadn't rigorously investigated the ultimate origins of the letters. In other words, in the context of the toxic politics of the 1880s, both the Times and Irish Unionists already, as they thought, knew, or rather believed they knew, that Parnell had blood-stained hands. They fully expected that evidence would be forthcoming. And the marketplace, in the shape of Richard Piggott, was only too willing to satisfy these expectations. The outcomes of the episode, well, Parnell was, at least for the moment, heroically vindicated. Hardline unionism was in disarray in Britain and Ireland. The Times itself, burdened by huge legal costs and falling circulations, struggled to compete, and the paper was bought over in 1908. The episode had a set of wider political and cultural impacts. For example, Richard Piggott and the Commission made their way into the work of James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake. Now, of course, the Piggott letters weren't the first or last example of forged misinformation in British politics, or indeed more widely. There was in France the Dreyfus case of the 1890s, and in Central Europe, a little bit later, Austria-Hungary, the Agram trials of 1909. Both cases where ethnic and national prejudice were linked to forgery and misinformation and injustice, the miscarriage of justice. In Britain, there was the Zinoviev letter of 1924, a forged letter purporting to come from the heart of the Soviet government and damaging to progressive politics in Britain at the time. In a slightly different register or vein, there were the Hitler diaries of 1983. This, as many will in the audience will recall, was the story of how two major news organizations in this country and in Germany, together with at least one eminent professor of history, I have to say, regretfully, a fellow of this British Academy, were conned by the work of a small-time crook in what the novelist Robert Harris has described as one of the most extraordinary frauds in history. With each of these cases, as in the 1880s, fakers and forgers were responding to commercial or political opportunity. Confirmation bias produced a lower standard of critical assessment than was necessary. Now, there were, of course, some critical differences separating these historic examples and the present day. The reach of particular media, though considerable, was tiny in comparison with the audiences now won by social media. Misinformation was then, I think, episodic, not sustained, not relentless, above all, not algorithmic. The scandals of these years were, in fact, exposed and resolved for the most part. On the other hand, I think different features connect these episodes and the present. We remain susceptible, often, to unevidenced allegation in the particular context of polarized debate, of emotional and polarized debate. We have a lower acceptance, often, a lower acceptance threshold for evidence which confirms our prejudices. We invest faith in particular forms of communication media. Governments and dominant media remain challengingly interconnected. The forms of media have changed over the decades and centuries, but malign actions and malign actors remain. As in the past, I think when these different components fail, there may be a perfect storm of misinformation. This time, however, I think, given the differences of scale, the storms may be more complete and more challenging than ever before.
Thank you, Alvin. Absolutely fascinating. Confirmation bias is already a kind of a theme that's emerging. The thing that I find really fascinating about the Piggott letters is it does appear to be a situation where misinformation was driven largely by financial gain. The politics was almost secondary.
I think that there were different actors and different motivations. So we're kind of focusing on the theme of misinformation, which on the whole suggests the propagation of lies, sometimes inadvertently.
Yes.
Disinformation, of course, suggests a more malign intent. So we have malign actors here. Richard Piggott, this hapless figure, illustrated, as you can see. The sketch is taken from the Special Commission itself. He's sketched in the dock, as it were, under pressure. He's fingering his beard. He's made a variety of concessions to the interrogation that he's been under. He's an absolutely scurrilous figure. As I say, continually broke, continually looking for a fast buck. His interest here is exclusively, I think, in the cash. It's possible that there are some complex and subtle political undercurrents here, but those, I think, have never really been fully demonstrated. But the other actors are concerned about the politics.
Right.
They are concerned about the politics. So the individual who delivers these papers to the Times newspaper is an interesting figure called Houston, former Times journalist and therefore very much known to the newspaper and therefore trusted within the newspaper itself. He has connections with the underworld of Dublin politics, so he has the sources, so it would seem.
So his credibility, in a sense.
Indeed, he has credibility, which is why the Times buys into the story. But he is motivated by his political passions. He is a passionate believer in the Union, a passionate antagonist of Home Rule. He's moved on from his journalistic career at this stage to embrace an Irish unionist organisation called the Loyal and Patriotic Union. So he's an activist within that body. He's a believer. He knows that Parnell is guilty, and all Piggott does is confirm that absolute conviction. And the Times, given its political kind of outlook at the time, given its relationship with government, which is unhealthily close, they are somewhere on this political spectrum of credulity as well.
Fascinating, credulousness. The only thing that was kind of redeeming about that story, which is perhaps not true today, is it did actually inflict some reputational damage on the Times, which now, when we think about the platforms, doesn't seem to be the case.
No, indeed. And I think that just reflecting about our conversation this evening and our session, it did strike me that one of the redeeming features of the episodes that I was defining for presentation, one of the redeeming features was that they were exposed. There was daylight brought in eventually, even with something as painful and protracted as the Dreyfus case. Light and oxygen of sorts are brought into this at the end. I'm hoping that this isn't a contrast with the 2020s, but we'll see.
Well, that's a conversation as well that we must have, one about whether we can even agree on the facts these days. Yasmin, a slightly different story here, and I think that, again, contrasts well about grabbing the narrative, establishing the facts that you choose to put into the public domain.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about 1857, which was the greatest rebellion in the British Empire at any point. And it's an epic story. I can't go into the causes, which were widely debated at the time, but it created a huge shift in the British Empire from company rule to crown rule, the establishment of Queen Victoria as empress. But I'm going to focus on 3 themes that I think reflect on how this moment was understood in Britain. And it's really a case, I think, of distorted information, or how information can be unbalanced rather than disinformation or misinformation, as we've been talking about. But I think there's lots of parallels with some of the things we've heard. Now, the uprising itself spread from a sepoy mutiny from a group of, I'm going to just change the image here, from a group of soldiers at Meerut, a northern Indian town, and spread into the countryside, involved royal leaders in India who had a coordinated but loosely connected uprising against the British, which involved uprisings in major towns and cities, most notably Delhi. And some of you may have read William Dalrymple's wonderful book about that. And we know now that 6,000 to 7,000 British people were killed during that uprising. Men, women, and children. Some of them were held hostage. Some of them were killed by troops themselves. Some of them died of disease and hunger. Historians also think that the Indian Rebellion led to the deaths of about 100,000 to 800,000 even, and this is where statistics can become very interesting, South Asian people, through bloody reprisals in the aftermath of the rebellion, but also through famine, which spread as crops were raised, and through cholera. And one of the pieces of evidence for that is the 1871 census. Now, I think there's 3 ways we might think in which this moment links to an unbalanced or a distorted sort of history. And one is the weight of the sources and the imbalance in sources. As historians, we have so much information about 1857 from English language sources, it's extraordinary. The weight of the sources, I could encourage you to have a look online. You can quickly just find all sorts of documents, memoirs, diaries, letters, papers. Pretty much every European who survived seems to have written something about their experiences of being in India during 1857. And this was in an age where publication was becoming, as Alvin mentioned, newspapers were picking up readership, print was really increasing. That a very popular 2-volume history of 1857 was rushed out in 1858 by Charles Ball. And it was 2 volumes, each volume was over 750 pages long. And I think what it shows us is how factual accuracy and information itself doesn't equal balance, because these 2 volumes are full of information about 1857. There are lots of things that attest to their accuracy. There's statistics, there's maps, there are all kinds of eyewitness accounts. And Ball himself saw this as a way of writing about, he says, the frightful details of a series of catastrophes, among which the lavish outpouring of innocent blood is the least evil to be deplored, to record acts of atrocity which cause manhood to blush for the species to which it belongs, and that have indelibly stained the annals of India and its people with crimes which disgrace the name of humanity. And we can see in the British press at this time that this becomes a very polarised and nationalised story. You can see in this image, which was in the magazine Punch, the British lion's vengeance on the Bengal tiger, with Britain depicted in the symbolic form of the lion and India as the tiger, when in fact, actually many Indian troops were involved in suppressing the uprising. But this was it became a very sensationalist story as well. Of course, there were South Asian sources for the uprising. There was Urdu poetry, there are Persian manuscripts, there is material, but getting that across to a British audience was very difficult. No Indian historian could write about it at the time, or up until 1947, really comfortably because of censorship and bans. So a lot of the material was in folklore, it was in poetry, rather than in a form which would have reached a British audience. You can see here, for instance, a beautiful picture which is in the Welcome collection of the Rani of Jhansi riding on horseback. She disguised herself as a man in order to lead her people in the fight as the rebels, as the mythology goes. But Ball's impression of comprehensiveness and detail and statistics, of course, tells a very partial and one-sided story in a very nationalist movement, in what was a very sensationalized movement, where people felt deeply aggrieved about what had happened. Dickens, who lost a son in the uprising, wrote about exterminating the race from the face of the earth. I mean, really very, very inflammatory and politicized language at the time, around 1857. And it's hard to underestimate, it's hard to remember now how moved and worked up people were in Britain about that. And one of the things which really generated that was the role of women and the fact that there had been women who had been killed, British women who had been killed. This depicts Miss Wheeler, who became a symbol of resistance in 1857. She was rumoured to have escaped and to have shot some rebels, but actually nobody knew what happened to her. And I think this speaks to my second theme, which is that gender nearly always plays a role, as we have heard, in the ways in which history is told, in which the way stories are told. And if we follow the gendered stories, it might lead us to contemplate and think about the role of disinformation or distorted information. There was a lot of prurience and a lot of interest in what had happened to women in 1857 in Victorian Britain. Over 100 novels were published in Britain after the event, reflecting on stories, often involving captives, hostages, women who had been affected on the European side, of course, very much leaving out the Indian dimension. And then my third point would be, and perhaps this gives us maybe pause for reflection, even optimism, is that what can be critically important at the time, what can be very emotive, what might really be stirring people up, can actually be forgotten. As I said, it's hard to overestimate how important 1857 was in British cultural memory. In the late Victorian period, there were oil paintings, monuments. If you go down the road to Trafalgar Square, you'll see Henry Havelock is on one of the plinths, who was killed in 1857 in the siege of Lucknow. Well, he died of illness, but during that siege. There's a message underneath that says, "A grateful country will not forget." Even into the early 20th century, Thomas Cook would take tours to sites of 1857 because it was still something which resonated in British society. But we wouldn't really think that now. And it hasn't really been sustained, I think, both in South Asia or in Britain as a visceral moment. Countries have good relations, and most people wouldn't now see this as a critical or pivotal moment in terms of bilateral relations or in present-day relationships. These stories and histories have been absorbed into national mythologies, and a sensationalized moment is no longer perhaps central to the framing of identities or politics as it seemed to be in 1857. So I think if the Victorians now look back on the way that we think about that moment, they would have seen what happened in absolutely different terms. And I think, just to end, I think what this example reminds me of is the importance of historians and history and taking sources, that even factual sources, even plentiful sources have to be looked at in the round. They have to be seen from different vantage points. The angle we take on things, the assessment of sources, the balancing is what we do. It's not just recounting facts.
Thank you. Yasmin, do you think that the lens of nationalism was what allowed this misinformation to be so powerful at the time, about 1857? There was a really kind of a widespread driver of not only the people who were putting their account out there, but for the market that wanted to hear this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think nationalism really was emerging in the mid-19th century in Victorian Britain, and we've just had the Crimean War as well, and people were really starting to talk in a different term about Britishness, and I think this is one moment at which that solidifies or takes on a kind of cultural form. So I think it is a nationalist moment. I mean, one of the things that's interesting also is how events were relayed differently by people who lived through them on the ground to the audience back in Britain itself. So often the memoirs and the diaries, when you look at them closely, are more nuanced, more inflected with detail, mention South Asian people, for instance. But these things become more and more kind of stripped down by the time they end up in the Illustrated London News or the Times. So we get these kind of much more kind of strident nationalist positions.
And do you think in the context of empire, there was a concerted effort by the authorities to make sure that they took hold of the narrative, that they got their version of events out there?
Well, partly, but there was also a bit of controversy about Canning, who was Governor General of India at the time, because he decided that there should be an amnesty for rebels who... well, there should be an amnesty for anybody who wasn't seen to have been actively involved in the rebellion, and that nobody who was just sort of within the wider community, within the village, should be prosecuted. And he was pilloried in the British press as Clemency Canning.
Right.
And so there was a controversy around, the ways in which the aftermath should be handled. So it wasn't, it wasn't just a straightforward story of. In that way, there were these nuances within it, but I think one of the things I just wanted to convey is really how strongly people felt this at an emotive level as well as at an intellectual or a factual level. The reading public was sort of scandalised, and there was this sensation around it at the time.
And if we throw forward just a partition and the creation of Pakistan at the moment of independence, you talk about the numbers and the way in which statistics were, used in the presentation of this story. That throws forward to partition as well, doesn't it? Whose numbers?
It does. I mean, whenever we talk about South Asia, we talk about huge numbers. Thinking of millions and millions of people. I mean, and one of the things which you see, and I'm afraid historians are really culpable in this, is the repetition of statistics, where if you go back and you trace the footnote and you trace the footnote, so where did this statistic come from? Can people really ascertain this? And one of the things around partition is a number which is often bandied around as 1 million having died during partition of 1947, when the state of Pakistan was created out of, and the modern state of India from the old British Empire. But at the time, the British government said 200,000. And there's actually been a recent study in Harvard where they have used all of the latest data, modelling and evidence, and they think it could exceed 1 million. So these very wide variations in data and facts and statistics, even for modern subjects.
So if I can open it out as a conversation between all three of you, if I stay with you for a moment, Yasmin, how much difference do you think, when you look at modern events, let's think about the Southport riots, for instance, how much difference do you think platforms make? If we imagine this in the modern context, where all of a sudden you've got the capacity, the rapid capacity to expand the access to information, would the misinformation around something like 1857 be even greater now? Would it be magnified, or was it as big as it could have been?
I think people, of course, circulation wasn't the same, there wasn't social media, but people were very aware of it, at least in even sort of the newspapers. The Illustrated London News was publishing sort of engravings like this, so I think people would have been aware of it. And I think we can sometimes, although I agree with Alvin that we're in a new moment, we can forget how there are these parallels really with these moments that motivate, that really stirred people up and made them feel very deeply and strongly at certain moments in history.
Esther, there's nothing very new in the end, is there? I think that's the thing that really strikes me when you look at this from ancient times to the modern day, that we all kind of like stories that play to our prejudices, and we're all guilty of that. But sometimes it can have very dangerous consequences, and sometimes it can be a bit of fun. But what would you say is the biggest parallel that you would draw when you think about this sort of trot through history that we've just had?
I mean, I think what really strikes me, I mean, particularly spending any time on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter X, is the ways in which gossip, a spat between two people, can blow up enormously and become world-changing. And I have Elon Musk's name in my head as I think about the way in which, or Trump, the ways in which a cursory comment spreads, is taken like a baton down, across and on a global scale. So, I mean, when I think about the communities I study, you can see the ways in which gossip gets handed on and passed around and becomes powerful and becomes, a capital charge. It will kill Socrates, the gossip that is told about him. Phryne escapes a capital charge, but only just. I mean, it's probably because it's not worth killing her, but because she's female. But in that sense of the ways in which we pass on a story because it confirms what we think, but also very much what's come through because it confirms what we feel. And it just brings me to think about the ways in which we still, I think, underestimate the power of emotion in the ways in which we communicate and make decisions. And that work in the field of sort of neuroscience and the history of emotions, I think is really important for us to understand how decisions get made, not only between, in everyday experiences, but on a global scale now. And that's what is happening, I see, that frightens me.
And Alvin, the speed at which we're exchanging information, if you think about the fact that the Times was involved in the Piggott letters and the Piggott forgeries, and actually it was one institution. We now spread these stories across the world. There is the media has been totally taken apart. It's fragmented. It's at war with itself, let alone with the politicians that it may or may not represent. Do you think that the sort of impact that those forgeries made then, was it contained by the fact that it was one newspaper in a way that perhaps these things are not containable now?
Yes, I think that there is a containment here. I think the circulation of the Times in the 1880s was, as a ballpark figure, around 50,000. Its influence, of course, was much greater than those numbers suggest. But if you, just taking your different points, Rutala, and running with them, if you put something into print, it's a fixed medium.
Yep.
Whereas social media has an accelerating effect, and it has an exaggerating effect. And I think maybe the toxic element that connects the 1880s with social media controversies is anger, intense emotion. But I would tentatively suggest that the difference between the 1880s and now is that anger is contained within certain parameters. The printed page being one of those, the conventions, the rhetorical and literary conventions of the particular newspaper that I've been discussing, in contradistinction to now, where there is a more untrammeled rhetorical and emotional violence. There are connectors, I think. Anger maybe has an existential dimension. I think that those in the 1880s were angry because some of what they had invested in was threatened, i.e. the union relationship between Ireland and Great Britain. And there's a whole variety of existential dimensions, I think, to the anger contained within social media now. It's just that there's no break.
Yeah, but it's interesting, when you have a political issue, there kind of is a market, isn't there? Because you know that a certain number of people support a political position. You might perhaps be trying to create a political position, but in general, if you're going to go, in the old days, if you were going to go with something like that, you knew there was going to be a market that would be interested, that would care about your forgery, your bias, your misinformation. Now, do we need a market or do we make a market? I mean, who had heard of wellness before 7, 8 years ago? But all of a sudden, we all know about wellness. We all know about wellness gurus. Is that something that has changed? No, you don't think that's changed?
I don't think that's changed. I'm just thinking about, I'm sorry, all my examples are Athenian, but I'm just thinking about the law courts. And I'm thinking about the ways in which when a speaker is making a speech about his opponent, he will get the gossip into the speech and he will say things like, well, we all know about X and Y. I would tell you about this, but I can't because it would endanger X and Y. And so what they're actually doing is, if you like, they're creating the market. They're creating the gossip by referring to gossip, whether it exists or not, I don't know. But that process of creating your market, I think, is part of the way in which this misinformation, this particular discourse of gossip is generative. It's actually, it creates as much as it reports.
And Yasmin, that's the other thing that I think is a thread running through what you've all described and to what we're experiencing today, is the driver of emotions, be it anger, be it envy, be it nationalism, polarization. Is that something that you think that parallel is actually really important, in that what happened in 1857 and what happened last week, those emotions are now being played on us even more intrinsically through an algorithm, not even through the written word.
I think it's a continuation of things that we see the seeds of earlier, perhaps, but now it's intensified. So this monetization of sensational stories, which that's got a long history. That goes back to the tabloid press and even earlier to the 19th century, to some of these kinds of stories. The creation of markets and for these kinds of images or products, but it's just now on steroids, isn't it? It's just so much quicker and faster moving, and I think the difference is about authority and trust. Really, I think now, yes, there may have been forgeries in the past, there may have been distorted information or gossip, but people had a sense that they could get their news from a particular type of source that had some authority and weight behind it. Whereas I feel now as a historian, our job is to train people to think about the sources that they're looking at and to really think about when you look at a text, when you look at an image, it's not always what it purports to be, or even if it is, how do we fit that into the bigger puzzle of what's going on in the world?
Absolutely. Alvin, as a historian, how do you feel about that lack of trust now that we have in facts? We can't even agree on the facts, like not even remotely some of the time.
In one way, I'm conflicted about this actually. In a sense, a lack of trust is actually a very fine historical quality, because you don't invest in a text. You approach the text critically. You deconstruct it. If the Times journalists of 1886 had been first-rate historians, they wouldn't have got themselves into the difficulties that they did. I think that the lack of trust is clearly a feature of the landscape, but in a sense, we as experts have brought it upon ourselves to some extent, because the history that certainly I've been seeking to illustrate is partly a history of experts standing on their various podia and getting it consistently wrong. So whether it be Hugh Trevor Roper, Lord Dacre with the Hitler Diaries in 1983, the graphologist and handwriting expert hired during the Dreyfus trials of the 1890s, the Times' graphologist and handwriting expert of 1887, the greatest luminary in his profession of the day, a man called Inglis, in 1887. So I think we've got to be realistic. While this distrust has a toxicity, it has clear and recognizable origins.
Interesting. Esther, I mean, you must be dealing all the time. The nature of your research means facts might be quite thin on the ground. So how do you decide, I guess part of your job is to convince people that your interpretation of the evidence that is available is not misinformation or is not factually incorrect. Is that part of your job?
I'd put it slightly differently. I think what I aim to make my students very aware of is that there are many different ways of interpreting a piece of evidence. And one of the things that we have to consistently question the interpretations that we bring to that evidence consistently, and so that we don't end up on podia saying it is only this story. There are other stories, and there are stories, really importantly, that have not been heard. Because I think one of the things that emerges from this is that who is it who is writing our stories? Who is it who has given us this evidence? What is it that we're seeing here? And often it's the people who have, as it were, won. Right? They are able to write the stories. And so who is silenced here? Who do we need to look for in more detail, with more care, whose voices aren't heard? And I think that's what we aim to do.
So a story that I used to tell when I used to speak to children in schools was, you support Arsenal, I support Spurs, we go to a game, Arsenal beats Spurs, you leave and you're delighted, and I'm, absolutely devastated. We were at the same game, but actually the way we will tell the story of that game is very different. Yasmin, in a world in which we're politically polarized, and some would argue that there is a section of society that's reluctant to debate, to have its views challenged, is that a world in which misinformation can actually thrive?
Well, I think your example of the football match is really apposite. It's one of the things I say to students is, if you want to know about something that happened in the past, please tell me at least a few books or articles that you read about it, not just one. You can't read one book about the French Revolution or one book about the First World War, because clearly you have to be able to triangulate and bring in different perspectives and as I was saying, look for the voices that aren't there. And that's been a big project in imperial history, is to try and think about which voices we haven't heard, how we might get to them, and in social history generally, the voices of women, the voices of the working poor. And I think in a way it's the same now. We just have to all be open to lots of different sources of information, to not close ourselves down, but try and seek the things that that we're curious about, and stay open, stay questioning, asking questions.
Alvin, are we more reluctant, do you think, perhaps to be challenged?
I think as a society, we need more of what I think many of us would regard as a central professional quality of the historian, namely empathy. I think you Spurs supporters need to empathise more with Arsenal.
Spurs supporters have a terrible time.
And I think politically and professionally, we need a little bit more empathy generally.
Esther, then, if you were thinking about history, what tools do you think it offers for us to navigate this shark-infested ocean of misinformation that I think we can all agree we face now?
I think my colleagues have come up with a couple of really good ones. I think empathy is really important. Curiosity about the past, openness about the past. I'm minded with your example about the two teams, that I think also we need to understand a little bit more about why people won't let go of their opinions. And I think part of that is to do with identity and a sense of identity and wishing to belong. And I think that also, to understand some of the ways in which people are motivated, some of the ways in which, if you like, our cognition works in order to better tackle and understand misinformation.
Yasmin, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there is something there that isn't, as we've alluded to, isn't just factual or going to be sorted out by evidence, and people aren't going to be won over with evidence, even with all the weight of fact. People will. It's not that these things aren't available. Lots of good, solid information is available, but people are not won over because there's something else going on, which is running deeper than that, and it could be nationalism, or it could be some other kinds of forms of identification, I think, and I think that's a real challenge for people who pride themselves on expertise.
Yes.
But also, as societies become more fragmented, as our media environment becomes more fragmented, it's actually difficult to arrive at a consensus. We all live in our little, silos where we're reinforcing the facts that happen to suit our particular narrative. And to some extent, social media arguably encourages that in a modern context. And is that problematic when we come to write the history of the present? Will it make it even harder?
See, there's also, I try to be optimistic, because I also think things get reported that are extreme, and things get sort of reinforced. Extreme things happen and get reinforced, but there's also a lot of things happening in localities, in communities that we don't know about. And I think we also have to think about what is it that's sort of spiraling and taking off in the role of journalists and everybody in keeping that momentum going, because there's also much quieter stories that we perhaps aren't always hearing.
It's in the excavation. Well, look, there is so much more to talk about. I am hoping that you've all got lots of questions around this. We can open the floor. Holly back there is going to wander around with a microphone. I can see a hand up. And we're going to take questions from those of you who are online as well. So we'll take that one at the back there, and then we'll come to you in the front. Go on. And if you can ask questions rather than make remarks, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just wanted to ask the panel to each nominate what they think has been perhaps the most important or era-defining or brazen examples of misinformation over the last 10 years.
Oh, a brazen bit of misinformation over the last 10 years.
The last 10 years.
You're allowed to dip back into, I'll give you permission to dip back into your area of expertise if you'd prefer. Who wants to go first? You're all looking a bit stumped. Shall I give you a moment to think about it? Because there's another hand up here at the front. We'll take that and we'll come back to that.
Thank you. You all spoke about confirmation bias, but not certainty bias. That in a world of generative AI, it's impossible to know what's true and what isn't. What lessons can we learn from history about teaching people how to hold things in uncertainty and overcoming certainty bias?
Esther.
I think that's a really interesting question. Living with ambiguity, living with uncertainty is very, very difficult, I think. And I think it is part of what people flee from in trying to find answers and create patterns. And we know our brains do that. So our brains will look for patterns when they feel overwhelmed. And so part of that, I think, also speaks to what we were talking about with identity as well. so that we know with things like cognitive dissonance that if something comes in, you know about this, to challenge your ideas, you're actually potentially going to promulgate them further because you are so invested in not the information, but in all the ways in which it gives you a community and a sense of yourself. And so I have no answers for you, but I think it is a terrific problem, or a terrific thing to chew on, a challenge. Thank you.
Alvin, certainty bias.
I think I invoked Hugh Trevor Roper of the Hitler Diaries scandal, and Trevor Roper, I think, once said that our inclination is towards mythopoeia, myth-making, story-making, rather than what he described as veracity. We like narratives, as Esther has said. We like that kind of set of certainties, whether in terms of our identity politics, referencing to nationalism and national mythologies, and so on, and so forth. Again, at the risk of a certain professional chauvinism, I will lay the historian's profession before you gently. I think that ambiguity and diversity, I believe, is at the heart of our historical enterprise. It's what we live with as historians, a spread of stories. I think one of the glories of our discipline is that diversification, the movement away from grand narratives, grand certain narratives, towards a multiplicity of voices. To that extent, I rejoice in the ambiguity.
Lots of people find it very, very frightening, don't they? Push back against it. Yasmin?
Yeah, I would just add to that the importance of the arts as well, of stories, of novels, of theatre, of film, because people love stories, and those things can act as vectors for knowledge, but also for empathy and for entertainment. And I think there's a lot of talk about the post-truth age, but it was a historical moment, the Enlightenment through to the 19th and into the 20th century. And it may be that we are moving into something. I'd be interested in what ancient historians think about that, into a different sort of time where information is more fluid. But as long as it's only when that's being used for pernicious ends that becomes a real problem, I think.
Interesting. I think we have a question from online.
This one is working, but hopefully you can hear me. I've got 2 questions from online, which I might share. The first question is, it sounds like the Twitter of ancient times was writing scrolls and pinning them on temple walls. So the question is, do you think the big difference between now and then is that we are moving backwards to a time where truth no longer matters, rather than at a time where the speed of the message has changed? And the second question is, how this discussion we've been having links to religion. The person asks, whether the decline of religion might have anything to do with a rise in misinformation, and whether that might explain why people are more attracted to misinformation.
Okay. Esther, the first one then. Truth no longer matters in an era where information can spread rapidly compared to the scrolls and inscriptions that you were describing.
So I think one of the things about studying the ancient world is, I know it looks like we don't have a lot of evidence, but it's what we do have comes through lots of different sources. And so, yes, I'm looking at a lot of different pieces, a lot of different voices, and in that world, identifying truth, actually this slightly links to the second question, is not a question that I think people would have a great understanding of. They're listening to everyone around them. They're trying to formulate an understanding of what's happened. In the law courts, you can see that happening. Across our sources, you can see people trying to understand what the situation is, and trying to place limits around what it is that they think is happening. But I would contrast that with the search for truth, which tends to happen in relation to the gods. So we're going full throttle ancient Greece now. You would go, if you wanted to understand and find truth, you would go to an oracle. An oracle is where you can speak directly to the gods. Why would you not, right? So you go to the oracle and you ask your question. And it's rather beautiful, because actually what you're going to get it back from Delphi, for example, one of the most famous oracles, is a riddle. And it throws the solving of the riddle back on you. And it isn't that something is fated and you have no agency. It's that you have agency in bringing that fate to bear. And so what is truth in that context? I don't know. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, because I've kind of lost track of the question. But I don't know if that there we live in a world, in the ancient world, in which I can see my sources struggling to find truth and not finding it, and myself dealing with lots of different pieces of information which don't give me one truth, but many different fragmented voices.
I was for a moment thinking that ChatGPT could be a bit like the Delphic Oracle, but I don't think that's right at all.
I think that's true. Check your footnotes, is what I would say if you use ChatGPT.
Alvin, this idea, I'm not sure I accept the premise that religion is in decline, but could the decline of religion be fueling misinformation?
I don't think I understand where the questioner is coming from, but I'm not, like you, I don't think I accept the premises. I fear that there may be an interrelationship between extreme religious conviction and misinformation, and that the hypothesis or the question might rather be, what is the interrelationship between fundamentalist religion of whatever variety or hue and the themes of this evening?
Yasmin?
I have some skepticism about putting science on one side and religion on the other, and I think as a social historian, I would tend to point to inequality first and the kind of underlying social and economic forces that are shaping society as drivers of this before thinking about religion. And even what is religion, in a way we can start to think, well, what is religion then too? Because sometimes what might look like, might look like religion is actually kind of operating more like politics or some other kind of
or even
force,
cultural or social movement.
So it's a tricky one, but I would kind of keep excavating around that.
Just to come back to the first question, you don't have to answer, but do any of you want to nominate a bit of misinformation that's really stood out for you in the last decade or longer?
I'm sitting with Zelensky being a dictator at the moment, and Ukraine invading Russia. So that's just, I mean, it's very immediate. I'm not looking back much further than that, but I kind of get to there and I'm like, oh, and stop.
I'm going to duck the question because I think that one of the possible distinctions between the different historical examples that we've been airing this evening and the present day is that we can define a set of episodic qualities historically. We can define a set of discrete case studies. I would hypothesize that the misinformation of the past decade has been a sequence rather than episodic, and that to try to distinguish highlights within what is a constant narrative of misinformation, disinformation, is probably, while I perfectly understand and appreciate where the questioner is coming from, I think it may be a mistake.
Yasmin?
Yeah, I was going to stick my neck out, but I'm now withdrawing it, because I think you're right, that it actually, everything that we've been saying is really about trying to see things from multiple perspectives and to think about the ways in which information has been created and generated, rather than, I don't want to draw on what might be moments where we know that politicians have exaggerated or lied or drawn on different kinds of examples. But I think what we're trying to get at is how we might better deal with that, rather than pointing the finger.
It's so fascinating. I've so enjoyed this conversation, because I think what you've drawn out is there is a line through history, but perhaps the moment we're living through now, if you like, the stakes are even greater. The political gains, the financial gains, and the nature of technology and social media mean that those things can happen very, very fast, in moments, in with the press of a button, with a click of a tweet. And it is a thing of our times, misinformation, but perhaps history will give us all perspective, and we can excavate beyond the tweets and the social media and get to what may eventually emerge as some kind of truth. But thank you all very much. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And thanks to those who are watching online. And do join the other elements of this series. I think there are a few more to come.